Streets are a global phenomenon. All around the world, in the smallest of settlements, streets exist as a phenomenon. Essentially, a street could be defined as any path in a settlement that buildings are directed towards. This means that even if the settlement lacks formal streets, then informally a street could still be there, existing as a main movement path for people. By this definition, one cannot differentiate specifically built streets in cities and vague bits of land in villages where buildings may be placed haphazardly. As in the latter, there still exists some sort of paths between buildings that, by their nature, serve the function of streets. This is why it's difficult to define good street design. Although all streets serve one main function, to be part of a transport infrastructure, global cultural differences not only affect the look of streets, but also local requirements and functions of streets themselves. The point of this video is to figure out if streets can have, on a global scale, some common aspects, the presence of which could make a street a universally fitting good street. For that, we'll be looking at two cultural spaces, Southeast Asia and the so-called West, meaning North America and Europe. The analysis will be based on looking at the street image of those two regions with the purpose of finding common aspects of what those regions consider good and bad. At the same time, it's important to remember that the number of common aspects have to be sufficient to consider a concept of the good street design universal. In case that the good street concept is in fact not universal, then one could ask the question, on what level can good street design as a concept be enforced? Is good street design a question of culture, regionality, or just something that has to be judged on a case by case basis, dependent on the specific functions of a specific street in the urban landscape? According to classical urban planning theories, public space is an area which belongs under public domain and isn't in anyone's private property. However, lately we've begun to consider public space as any area where access isn't restricted, or, open space. Applying this thought to streets, we can see how streets are a mix of public management and private property, but still public or open space. Theoretically, everyone has access to streets. Accessibility is another factor in itself, and it makes streets the most basic form of public space. This is where the various functions of streets come into play. Jacobs identified the main functions of sidewalks: safety, contact, and the assimilation of children. But it's important to see what functions a street fulfills on the scale of the whole city. Is it even possible to compare a quiet residential street to a large thoroughfare? Both seemingly fill different functions and, on a purely functional level, fill those functions rather well. However, from the viewpoint of public space, harsh criticism can be applied to both. Even though each street is an open space and a public space, then a street cannot be automatically considered a public space. So if a street's main purpose is to be just transit, then it does not fill the function of public space. Jacobs brought out a similar comparison between open and public space. Criticizing modernist architecture, she presented the main faults of large open spaces between new apartment buildings. Ask a Hauser how his planned neighborhood improves on the old city, and he will cite as a self-evident virtue more open space. Ask his owner about the improvements in progressive codes, and he will cite again as a self-evident virtue their incentives towards leaving more open space. Walk with a planner through a dispirited neighborhood, and though it be already scabby with deserted parks and tired landscaping festooned with old Kleenex, he will envision a future of more open space. More open space for what? For muggins? For bleak vacuums between buildings? or for ordinary people to use and enjoy. The existence of open space does not make it public space. This also applies to streets. Just because the open space is there does not mean it will be used as a public space, no matter whether we are dealing with a large thoroughfare or a narrow residential street. A street as public space only exists with a community that actively uses these streets as public space. Based on that, a street cannot, as a public space, fill a monofunctional role. Jacobs and Tonnelat emphasize a certain feeling of community when streets are used as a public space. Tonnelat presents as an example Bologna in the 1960s, where existing public space was used to bring together the local community. This means that when searching for a good street, we cannot handle just one specific street, but instead we have to look at the entire settlement as a whole and see how streets relate to each other. For example, here in Estonia, these so-called Main Street projects are widespread, where one street is converted into a mainly pedestrian street with various recreational means, making that street into a public space. According to Jacobs's theories, just one of these is not enough. It's useless on its own. It's the same with French planners of the 1980s who focused on the concept of block and street, which by its nature was reminiscent of 19th century planning. A good street as a public space means a dense street network with small blocks and where land use is diverse, meaning various services are accessible only a short walk away. These tendencies can be seen in Southeast Asian cities, where streets have been described as lively and filling more functions than just transit. The street is either a temporary or permanent place of commerce, a place for gathering, a place for political or religious discourse, and so on. This has often been explained by the fact that cities in the region are usually densely populated, where houses have insufficient space and everyday life has moved to the street. For example, in Ho Chi Minh City, one can spot in the streets and alleyways various celebrations. The street space has been taken over by local traders and artisans, and local traffic moves through them, creating a dynamic street picture. In this case, it's very important to note that in Southeast Asia, the public space has appeared on the streets more spontaneously, not as a result of direct planning. Even though this cannot be described as community or grassroots planning, locals still have been given a free rein over designing their own settlement, except in places where efforts are being made to eliminate such dynamic streets. It is as if in Southeast Asia, a street image that we're trying to deliberately plan in the West has developed historically and on its own. A dense street network with a diverse use means that public space surrounds nearly every house in those cities, with the exception of colonial era squares and wide boulevards. But what about mobility? In Vietnam, for example, motorcycles are widely used, for which narrow streets filled with people aren't an obstacle. In the car-oriented West, however, we're used to having enough space on our streets for cars. Looking at the big picture, personal mobility is the only major difference between what's considered a good street in the West and what already exists in Southeast Asia. Taking that in mind, the concept of the good street can be applied to anywhere in the world, but one must take into account local needs and culture, especially when considering mobility and accessibility. This is why we can't dismiss the need for wider roads, as people still need to get around fast and efficiently. So, the concept of good street design is almost universally applicable. Using those same principles but adjusting to local needs, we can create an urban environment that is human centric, lively, and dynamic. The main characteristics of good street design are coherence with other streets, possibility to use it as public space, multifunctionality of buildings, and streets wide enough to provide mobility and accessibility, by prioritizing pedestrians in its design. While this can't be applied to every street, after all, obduracy is a thing which will be discussed in a different video. These concepts can be applied on a neighborhood to neighborhood basis while keeping the overall coherence of the city in mind. Thank you for watching. If you liked it, hit like and subscribe, and maybe share this so I can get internet urbanist points or something. Stay tuned for more, and remember, trans rights are human rights, Black Lives Matter, and also abolish ICE.